Hi, this is smoothing or finishing your clay sculpture. I work with Chavant Clay. I work with the NSP Medium and the NSP Hard. It comes in these 2-pound blocks, or it comes in a 10-pound block if you have a larger project to work on. I also use their CM50. Comes in this billet, and it's an industrial design clay. It's a medium hard clay. It's the softest of their industrial clays, and it has a higher wax content than the NSP clay, so you'll find that it can be grainier and not have quite as smooth a finish as the NSP, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Use your medium NSP in the winter time and use the hard NSP in the summertime. You're going to find that both of them have a tendency to get sticky at times, and it may be that there are certain times when you just don't work with the clay at all and then come back with it a little bit later on and see if the consistency has changed at all. I try to keep my studio between 60 and 65 degrees at all times. I know that's a little chilly in the winter time, but if you put on a sweatshirt or a sweater, you'll find that after you've been working for 10 or 15 minutes that you wind up taking the sweater off because you just warm up naturally from working on your sculpture. Some of the other products we're going to be using today are your Scott shop towels. These are the blue towels. They're less likely to shred than the white paper towels that you get in the store. We're going to need some latex gloves or vinyl gloves. These are available at Home Depot. The shop towels are available at Home Depot as well, or you can get them from your auto parts store. We're going to need some Scotch-Brite heavy-duty scour pads, and these come in a 3-pack. They're the thin pads. Same thing as on the back of sponges. We don't need the sponge, we just need the scouring part. So you can pick up a 3-pack. They're available at Home Depot or your local grocery store. We're going to need a spray bottle with some water in it. We're going to need a couple disposable cups. I have plastic. Paper would probably work better for this project, but that's all I had today. We're going to need a couple of bristle brushes. These are oil painting brushes, and a small and a medium will work well for this project. We're also going to need a pair of safety glasses. These are to protect your eyes. Better safe than sorry. The main product that we're using is called CitraStrip. It's a safer paint remover and stripper, and it's suitable for indoor use, and it doesn't have any harsh fumes to it. It's available at Amazon, Lowe's, and Home Depot. So those are the supplies that we're going to need for this project. So let's get started. So I have 2 clay sculptures here. One with the red clay, which is the NSP Medium. This sculpture has a full aluminum armature in it, right down to her fingertips. And then I have a brown sculpture here, and that's the CM50 clay. Now, this sculpture has an armature between her shoulder blades, and I also put some aluminum wire in her fingers just because they're a little delicate. Otherwise, she's completely freestanding. She's got these 2 pillar legs, and because the CM50 has the higher wax content, it's able to support itself better. My sculpting technique is a little bit different from what most people do. Both of these figures are unfinished at this point, and you may be saying that they look finished. When I was a student, my teacher would always tell me to use my tools. she would always say, Dana, use your sculpting tools. I was very tactile about sculpting, and in my second year my teacher said, use whatever works best, and that was my official permission to use my fingers. So 75 to 80% of the sculpting that I do is done with my fingers. They're 98.6 degrees, so they naturally soften the clay and it makes it easy to move around on the surface. The body of the sculpture itself has to be done with tools, but once I've gotten the basic shape that I'm interested in, then I go to work with my fingers just to move the clay around, and so I naturally smooth as I'm sculpting. So yes, my sculptures do look smoother than probably most people's sculptures that you see. Okay, at this point what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down these Scott paper towels around the base of the sculpture, and these are the blue tape paper towels, the heavier duty stuff, and the idea being that I'm going to be using that spray bottle with water, and I don't want the water running all over the floor when I'm spraying the clay. So this is going to help just absorb some of that water and keep it from running on the floor and all over the table. Okay, now we can actually move on to the actual smoothing. Okay, I have down my paper towels to absorb the water. I have a cup of water here with my bristle brushes in it, and I have an empty container. It's running about 68 degrees in my studio today. It's the beginning of June, so it's warming up outside. The clay is firm, but it's still a little soft. So I'm going to change this a little bit and do something, change my method a little bit, and we'll continue some of the method with the other piece of sculpture, because that's a firmer clay. It'll work out better on that. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to use the Scotch-Brite heavy-duty scour pads on this piece because I don't think it really needs it, and I'm not going to be working on flesh here. I'll work on flesh on the other piece so you can see how I do that. I'm going to be basically working with fabric here, so it's not as critical as far as smoothness is concerned. It needs to be smooth, but because it's fabric, it's going to flow a little bit different than skin is. So we're going to skip the scour pads for this step. So what I'm going to do here is, you can take the citrus strip and spray it directly onto the sculpture. It has a tendency to overspray, so it goes where I don't always want it to do, and of course naturally it's going to react with the clay. So what I want to do is I'm going to take my other plastic cup and I'm going to spray some of the citrus strip into the cup and then use my bristle brush to put it onto the sculpture. Now I got to work kind of fast because the citrus strip will actually attack the plastic cup and it will melt it. So I'm just going to take it and spread it on the clay relatively quickly here. Like I said earlier, probably a paper cup would be better for this, but I didn't have any paper cups to use, so we're going to just work with the plastic cup, and if it eats through, I'll just kind of turn the cup around to the other side and use the other side of the cup. I need a little bit more citrus strip. You don't really want to work in too large an area at one time. This is a relatively open area, so I'm trying to cover as much of it as I can so you can see what happens when the citrus strip goes on. I don't want to really deal with any detail parts because that kind of slows me down, and then you kind of have to work with a smaller area. You should really work with about half of the space that I'm working with here until you get adjusted to how the citrus strip works. Since it's designed to take off paint, all I really want it to do is soften just the top surface of the clay. So I'm not going to leave it on a real long time. I'm going to work it in with my finger next. Take your brush and put it back in the water because the citrus strip will eat the bristle brush away, and then you'll just be wound up with a stub of a brush to work with. So now what I'm doing is I'm using my fingers to kind of rub the citrus strip into the clay, and at the same time my 98.6 degree fingers are going to help soften the clay a little bit. So we're smoothing with the citrus strip and we're smoothing with my fingers. And of course I have on my rubber gloves, I have on my safety glasses so that it doesn't get into my eyes. And I'm just going to keep working this around for a few minutes until I start to see a little bit of breakdown in the clay. And actually it's going to be kind of hard for you to see in the video, but when you're actually doing it, you'll be able to see it better because the citrus strip will kind of change to the color of the clay itself. So the citrus strip will actually kind of turn a little bit from an orange to a red as it starts to break down the clay. I've never left the citrus strip on for a long time. I know the recommendation on the citrus strip when you're breaking down paint is to leave it on for X number of hours until it starts to dissolve that paint. But all I'm interested in is the citrus strip dissolving that top layer of clay. And once that happens, then I want to get the citrus strip off of it as quickly as possible. It's easy to go back, and if you find that you have areas that aren't as smooth as you like, you can go back and redo those areas with a second spraying of the citrus strip. And you know, if you're new at this and you really haven't gotten your sculpture as smooth as you like, you may have to do 3 or 4 sprayings of the citrus strip and just work it in and work off that top layer. I don't know what would happen if I left this on. I don't know whether it would actually dissolve all the clay or not, but I don't want to really lose my detail, so I'm not going to take the chance of doing that. All I want to do is take off a thin layer and deal with it a thin layer at a time. And I'm actually talking about like a micro layer. It's incredibly thin, and you're actually going to find that as you go along with this and as you go through the process that you can make it nice and smooth and it will look good, and it will make things easier as time goes on in the project. But you're going to go through several other steps in the process. See, now I'm getting off little layers of clay here that I want to wipe off. If you're making bronze, you're going to find that you'll have an opportunity to do some more smoothing when the sculpture is made into its wax model. And that would be like the next step after the sculpture is done. You'll have a rubber mold made, and then you will the foundry will cast it in wax. And then once you've gone over it and approved the wax model for the foundry, then they will cast it in bronze for you. And then you'll have a second opportunity at the foundry to smooth the piece out when it's cast in bronze. So it's not just the clay step. I mean, obviously you want the clay to look as good as possible, but you're also going to have the opportunity to smooth it out in the wax process and in the metal process. Okay, so I'm thinking this is looking fairly good. I can take the smaller brush and I can work it into some of the folds and crevices in the fabric, some of the tighter spots that my fingers won't reach. And actually, because there's a larger buildup of the citrus strip in these tighter areas, you probably don't have to do too much work. It's also an area that is not necessarily going to be seen. I mean, it's going to be seen, but it's not going to be seen like the open areas of the sculpture. So it needs to kind of flow in with the rest of the sculpture, so it needs to blend in. But if you still have a little bit of rough areas in the folds and in the crevices of the fabric and whatever sculpture you're working on, it's not really going to be as noticeable. So as long as it blends, you'll be in good shape. Okay, I'm getting a lot of the clay starting to soften and loosen up here. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bottle of spray water and I'm just going to wash off the citrus strip. And you want to make sure that you get in any areas that have those crevices that are going to hold water, and make sure that you wash out all that citrus strip, because if it stays in there, it's going to continue to soften that clay, and then you may have the holes forming in your sculpture where the citrus strip actually comes through the other side, which means then you're going to have to do some repairs. I don't know whether you can see the water running off of this onto the paper towels, but it's just washing all that citrus strip out of the cracks and crevices and off of the surface of the clay. Okay, so it's a little soft, and if you find that once you've done this that there's still some rough areas that you're not happy with, or you find little indentations where maybe you stuck your fingernail into the clay, or there's little pits that you didn't think were there, you can do a second layer. You can smooth out those areas with your modeling tools. And you could also use the Scotch-Brite scouring pads, which I'll demonstrate on the other sculpture. At this point, what I want to do is just kind of blot some of the water off. I don't want to really rub it at this point. I just want to get some of the excess water off. One of the things that you're going to find, especially with this NSP clay, is that you really need to give this stuff time to dry overnight, because the clay may not look soft, but it actually is. So if you do have to do repairs, if you have little pits in the clay that you don't like, those little fingernail marks or whatever, you really need to wait overnight and give that clay time to firm up again. and then you can begin to fill in those spots. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that because the clay is soft, it's going to just kind of reject that additional new clay that you try to add to fill in those pits. And it may be not an ideal stopping point for you when you're working, but it's better off if you wait a good 12 hours to 24 hours before you do anything as far as additional repairs are concerned. So this looks pretty good. There are some tiny little marks, but again, it's fabric, so it's not, it's not like skin, so it's not quite as critical. I can go along, and at this point I can take off the latex gloves. I don't really need them because I've washed the chemicals off of it, but you can go along and smooth out some of the imperfections. It's fairly easy to smooth them out, and you're just being very gentle with it. We're not like trying to gouge. We don't want to use the tools. We just want to move that surface gently so that it fills in. And sometimes what's going to happen is it's going to move more than you want it to. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my gloves off at this point. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on with the surface when I've got the latex gloves on. It's better if I can actually feel the clay under my fingers. And now I'm just gently moving the surface, working out any little imperfections that I can see with my eyes, so that you have a smoother surface for when it goes to the foundry. And actually, the more imperfections you get out at this point, the easier it is, because when you're working with wax, it's a completely different feel and a different process. And usually when I go to the foundry, I like to let the professionals do the job, and I just usually take my black marker and mark the spots that I think need to be corrected, and I let them do it so that I don't have to actually get into it. I actually spend a fair amount of time at the foundry when the piece has been cast in bronze, and I will work with the bronze, but as a sculptor I would prefer just to do the sculpting in the clay and then just leave the foundry work to the foundry people, to the professionals who can do a better job. They do it every day, and I only do it once in a while. But I like to work with bronze because it allows me to follow through on that final step, so that I know that I've got just the finish that I want on the piece. When they're ready to put the patina on it, and I know that it's going to look good once that patina's been put on. So there's a little bit of roughness. I could conceivably do a second or maybe a third coat. Just working with my fingers seems to be solving most of the problems. And like I said, I'll want to come back probably again tomorrow and do the same thing with my fingers again. Not using anything other than my fingers, just looking for those minor blemishes that still show up in the clay. And then if necessary, and there's like one or two spots that need to be filled in with clay, I can do that. or I can go with another layer of citrus strip on it and just repeat this process all over again. But usually if I can help it, I will just use my fingers for this process. I won't actually go in for the citrus strip. So again, like I said, depending on your technique and how you do it, you may have to use several layers of the citrus strip. I don't think I've ever done more than 2 applications of the citrus strip. But it's certainly not going to hurt. If you need to do multiple sprayings of the citrus strip, go for it. Just make sure that you give yourself the time in between. Make sure the clay has time to regain its stiffness between sprayings. I've never done one spraying right on top of another. I've always given it a good 24 hours before I've done a second layer or tried to fill in any areas that were low spots that just didn't conform to the consistency of the rest of the piece. So give it time. I know it can be frustrating when you're waiting and you want to work on it, but better safe than sorry, so that you don't run into a situation where you're gouging a hole through the piece. I'm going to use one of my rubber tipped tools here just because I've got a little piece that's in this fold that I can't reach with my finger, and my finger is creating problems because my fingernail's digging into the clay. There we go, that's better. Okay, it doesn't really take long to do. I'm not timing this, so I don't know how long it takes, but I think that doing a small area like this shouldn't take you more than 10 or 15 minutes to do. And then you can just move on to another section of the thing. And that way you don't have the whole sculpture covered with citrus strip and the thing is melting on one side while you're trying to work on the other. So small bites is the safest thing. Okay, and that's it. I've got some texture in the fabric up here, so I don't know whether it looks rough or it looks like folds of fabric. From where I am, it looks more like folds in fabric. And I'll look at it one more time once I go over the whole piece again, and once I've used the citrus strip on the whole piece. And if anything is glaring to my eye, I'll go back and rework it. But at this point it looks pretty good, and I think that once it's cast in bronze, it's gonna come out very nice. So okay, that's it for this piece. Like I said, it needs to sit for 24 hours. It needs to dry. Make sure that you don't see any of the citrus strip in the cracks. Double check that. If you see some orange in the cracks, you need to either use your brush to work it out or use the spray bottle to kind of pressure washer it out of those seams, because if it stays in there, it will continue to soften your clay and you'll wind up having pieces falling off of your sculpture. So that's it for this. Now we'll move on to the other sculpture. This is the CM50 clay, the industrial grade clay with the higher wax content. I'm not going to show you the whole piece because, like the other piece, this is a work in progress and it has a lot of unfinished areas. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to work in this center mass area of her chest and her belly. It's a relatively open area that will show you the technique, and we're pretty much going to do the same thing that we did last time. The only difference is I've cut up the Scotch-Brite scour pads into these little pieces that are like 3/4 of an inch by 1.5 inches. They're big enough to hold on to with 2 fingers and still give you some area to work with. So basically what we want to do at this point is take this and kind of use it just the same way you would use a feather. You really don't want to be hard on the surface. This scouring pad has got a pretty rough texture to it. You want to create a little bit of texture, and you want to do some kind of cross hatching on it so that it shows the contours of the flesh. And you're looking to just not so much change the surface, but you want to just kind of smooth the surface, so it's got to be very light. Just like you were using a feather. You could probably use something softer like a cloth to get a similar effect, and you can see that it picks up quite a bit of clay. So once it reaches a certain amount of clay on the scouring pad, it's going to clog the pores of the pad, and you kind of have to turn it over and move it to a different section, which is why I am cutting it up into such small pieces so that I can keep turning it over and turning it over, and then once those pores in the scouring pad are full, I can just toss it aside and pick up another one. So very light. All we want to do is reach the surface. If you do it too hard, or if too much clay builds up in the scouring pad, what it's going to do is it's going to scar the sculpture. So you don't want to scar it, you just want to kind of smooth it out a little bit. And I can't see the whole thing without getting in the way of the camera, so I'm going to just do part of her. But you'll get the idea of what I'm doing. So back and forth, cross hatching is what you're looking for. And sometimes if you have deeper ridges, you kind of have to fold the pad in half and then just stick it into those deeper ridges so that you kind of reach all the areas. And what you're trying to do is basically just change the coloration of the clay. And I don't know whether you can see it in the video, but where I've gone over it with the scouring pad, the clay has become lighter in color than the other areas. So and turn it over so I got a clean area to work with here. Okay, in the process of doing this, what I'm hoping to do is lighten the areas that the scouring pad is reaching. And I don't know whether you can actually see it in the video or not, but we have little spots that are like right here that's darker, here that's darker, here that's darker, here that's darker. And these are actually little indentations in the clay that need to be filled in. And this would be a good time to take your clay, just a little spot of clay, fill in each one of those holes, smooth it down with your tools or with your finger, and then go back to the scouring pad and smooth it out again so that it's consistent with the rest of the piece. Now I'm not going to do that here on the video because that's going to take too much time. I want to show you the actual technique, but you know how to work with clay, so filling in little indentations to level off the surface shouldn't be that difficult to do. And that's something that you should be able to handle on your own without me showing you how to do it. Okay, so we're ready to use the citrus strip. I have on my latex gloves, I have on my glasses, and I don't have a cup. So, okay, here's what we're going to do. So I'm going to do what I said I didn't want to do, and that's just spray it on her. Take my brush, smooth it around, work it into the surface. Now with me doing the larger areas so that you can see the technique, it's not much different doing the the crevices, between her arm and her chest and under her breast and around her fingers and things like that. Just takes a little bit more time. The technique is no different. You're going to do follow the same steps. It's just that you're going to need to use a smaller brush to get into the tighter areas. Maybe you want to try using a rubber tip tool to do it. You just kind of have to basically be gentle and get it worked out, get it smoothed out. I really haven't finished her breasts, so I'm not going to do them. They're kind of still a little on the lumpy side at this point because this one's sculpture is away from being finished, but it's finished enough here that I can show you the technique. Now, again, put your brush into water so that the bristles don't get eaten away by the citrus strip. And I'm going to take my fingers again and work the clay. Again, I'm looking for the citrus strip to change color, and it's already starting to do that. The citrus strip is starting to turn brown, so that's good. So that means it's softening that surface. Oh, and I meant to say that I put the light on the side of her so that hopefully the light will rake across the front of her. I don't know whether you'll be able to see it in the video, but her chest and her belly were fairly rough, and I finished it to about the stage that I would typically finish it to. And I also left it a little bit rougher just so you could see how the citrus strip actually works. Now you can see how the clay is melting on my latex glove, and it's turning them the same color as the sculpture. So I know it's working. I know it's softening that top surface of the clay. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I have my paper towels down, so I'm going to just spray her down really good and wash all that citrus strip off of her so that it doesn't keep reacting with the clay. Now, since this has a higher wax content, you get a little bit different effect with it. And I'm going to just, again, pat it dry. And the brown you're seeing on the paper towel is what's coming off my glove. It's not actually soaking through the paper towel. And you can see the towel is wet, but it didn't actually come through. So she's kind of wet all over here. Okay, now since we have a higher wax content in this clay, it really softens this area up. And I don't know whether you can see it, but it's actually making it, it's skinning the surface so that the surface is like peeling off. And what you want to do is kind of take your paper towel and just wipe that off. Very gently you want to do it, because the clay is definitely soft and you only want to take off so much clay. You don't want to take off everything, but you want to take off that top surface. And you can see there's the clay is coming off. I'm going to take my latex gloves off at this point so that I can feel the clay. And I'm just going to kind of go over that surface again with the heat of my fingers, just gently smoothing the clay. I'm not really pressing on the clay, I'm just using the weight of my finger. And I periodically have to wipe my fingers off because the clay still continues to come off some. And again, you're going to have to probably use a rubber tip brush to help round out the tight areas like her navel. And there's some pretty soft clay in her navel right now, so we want to make sure that we get that out, because there may be citrus strip in there and we don't want it to stay in there. So that looks a little better, but she's definitely smoother than she was. And there's a little bit of clay that's accumulated down here because I can't get my finger in there, so we're gonna just kind of wipe it out and wipe it on my paper towel. I'm trying not to get my head in the way of the camera here so that you can see what I'm doing. Okay, That looks pretty good. So again, I'm going to let it harden up overnight. The wax is kind of soft and the surface is still kind of soft. And what I'll do is I'll look for imperfections again, and if necessary, I'll either fill in. It looks like there's a little dimple in this area that may need to be filled in. Otherwise, she looks pretty good. But because it's skin, I want it to be as smooth as possible. So I'll go back and use just my fingers again tomorrow when it's firmed up and the wax is hard again and the clay is good and solid, and just touch it up again. And then, like I said, if you find voids or fingernail marks or whatever in the clay, tomorrow it'll be firm enough that you can take some fresh clay and fill in those spots, and it should stick. And then you just smooth it out, and you can either smooth it out with your fingers, or you can go back and use another coat of citrus strip if you want to. And that's pretty much the process. If you have any future questions, you can reach me through danamaranto.com. My email address is there, and you can look at the website. All of the sculpture that I have there has gone through the same process as what you've seen here today as far as the finish is concerned. Okay, and that's it. Thank you for watching.